Hello and welcome to Narrative Drivetime, a show about storytelling where we talk to storytellers. I'm Craig Colby. I've told stories on television for 30 years. I have a storytelling company called Colby Vision. Right there is Paul Romanuk, a storyteller in many different respects, a play-by-play man extraordinaire, and also the host and author of a new podcast called The Walrus Was Paul. Paul, thank you very much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Yeah, nowhere I would rather be than sitting in my basement talking to you.
Where else can we be but in our basement talking to people? I guess it's opened up a little bit more now. We're doing this in the middle of COVID times.
But it is great to see you. Craig and I go back a long, long way, and it's always fantastic to sit and chat with you. So even if I'm sitting in my basement on a nice day.
Well, the people who watch the show, and we do have some of them, they're in for a real treat. Paul is one of the most interesting guys I know, always very animated and excited about the things he's doing and things going on in the world. And a good reason to be animated and excited about your latest project. We'll talk about the podcast first. The Walrus Was Paul. What is that podcast? And I'm guessing you are part of the Paul in that.
Well, if Beatles fans would get it, and it's definitely a podcast for Beatles nerds, if you will, of which I am one, of which there are millions. But it's from a Beatles lyric, a song called Glass Onion on the White Album, where John Lennon says, "And here's another clue for you all, the walrus was Paul." And that goes back to Magical Mystery Tour when they were all wearing animal costumes for one of the scenes. And there was always speculation as to whether the walrus was Paul or was the walrus John. So it's just a bit, the name of the podcast is just sort of a play on that. What the podcast is about is I talk to Canadian music people about their favorite Beatles or Beatles solo record, and we go through it track by track. And I was inspired to do this both by my love of the Beatles and music and hands-on production, but also there was a British podcast. There is a British podcast called I Am the Egg Pod, and it's produced in the UK with a British host, and not surprisingly, he talks to mostly British people about their favorite Beatles or Beatles solo album, and they go through it track by track. So I heard this and thought, man, that's a great podcast, and I would love to put my own twist on it. So my twist is that I talk to mostly Canadian musicians, but in general, Canadian music people to come on and do this. And it's been a lot of fun, and it's been a success so far. I'm really enjoying it.
Well, it has been a success. I've listened to the first one and into the second one, and I'm not a big Beatles fan. I like the Beatles, like most people do, but I think it's outstanding. The research that goes into it is excellent, and hearing people for whom listening to the Beatles isn't just artistic enjoyment, but who can look at it from a craftsman's point of view is always fascinating. And I think you've done a great job with that.
Well, thanks. And that's the twist I was hoping to put on it is, when you're talking to Jim Cuddy or Colin Cripps or Stephen Page or Dave Bedini or Jane Gowan, I mean, these people are working musicians who've achieved varying levels of success, and they're songwriters. And so they listen to a Paul McCartney song or a John Lennon song, a Beatles track, and, they're hearing things that you don't hear. And by that, I mean, well, I know how he got that guitar sound, or isn't that interesting how they changed the time signature in the bridge? And of course, we hear all those things, but it's much like an athlete or a coach watching a sporting event. They watch it with a different eye. And I'm trying to make them explain that eye, if you will, that they're watching it with in terms that your average music listener can understand. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, you're well prepared for that because you have spent a good part of your career sitting beside an expert and trying to get insight out of them about what we are seeing and listening to. And of course, I'm referring to your career as a play-by-play person. This show is about storytelling. What kind of storytelling do you do as a play-by-play person?
Well, the best way to put it, there are a number of different sort of approaches I could take to that question, but the simplest answer is to say when you're doing a live play-by-play broadcast, the type of storytelling you're doing is live. You're narrating a live unscripted story that is taking place in front of you. So what you're trying to do is guide the viewer, listener along and point out different things to them in that storyline that you hope they will find entertaining and relevant to what they were watching. Very technical answer to just explaining what's in front of you to the person at home and trying to deconstruct it a little bit. And when you go into hockey is the sport I'm most familiar with in terms of play-by-play, but I've done baseball and football and soccer and basketball and other sports. But when you go in, you sort of have an idea what some storylines might be. However, so often, because it's live and by its very nature unpredictable, those storylines that you thought were going to be significant going in end up not being significant at all. And other storylines may develop. So you have to be prepared to pivot, is the modern parlance, to refocus on what it is that's happening right now.
You have a lot of obligations as a play-by-play person. You're the things people don't think about are you have to work in promos, you have to make sure you get to break, you have to listen to the producer, you have to pay particular attention to the color person to set them up. In a lot of ways, you're the point guard, right? You have to distribute the ball, the information as it's going on. How much time do you have to reinforce a narrative that either is one you've guessed would happen or one that you are seeing in front of you?
Well, in hockey, not much at all. I mean, it's you being in the TV business for as long as I have. I mean, it's a cliche and that you hear from people, executive producers typically, who are talking to you about a show or a game, and they're always don't forget to tell the stories. It's all about the stories. Well, there's no time in a live NHL broadcast in 2020 to tell any stories. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. I mean, it just flies at you. The game is so fast, and then you have business that you have to get in, commercials, sponsored items. Plus, you just have to, the color commentator is going to want to see replays of things that have just recently happened in the game. So your ability to weave in a story, I'll go into every game with 4 or 5 of them based on conversations that I've had with a player after the morning skate, or with a coach, or something that I've gleaned from research that may tie in something that happened in their junior career that can be transposed to their pro career. Just stories. And you don't have time to tell them. Like, you just don't. It flies by. Very different in baseball, basketball to a lesser extent, soccer, but in hockey, you don't have time. You go in and you just try to tell the story, narrate the story that's taking place right in front of you. That's all you can do, really.
And, storytelling, I can sympathize with the executive producer because I've done shows where you try to reinforce a story. And a lot of times it's just peppering in little things to hit the theme, to make sure that you've got some sort of narrative backbone to carry you from information to information. In a broadcast like that, who determines what the story is?
Well, it depends. Usually it's the producer. And the producer is the conductor of the orchestra, if you will. And the producer is going to go in and they will usually dictate the narrative of the broadcast. However, I've had it happen slightly differently. And then you get different types of producers. You have some producers who go in and they're prepared for all eventualities. A guy I worked with at Hockey Net in Canada is one of the most brilliant sports producers I've ever worked with, a guy named Mark Askin. And Mark has an encyclopedic knowledge and recall of what he has on what's called his travel reel. And a travel reel in basic terms is it's digital now. It's not a reel, but it's a digital file of goals, highlights, tons of items that you can drop into a show. And there are, on a big reel, there can be dozens and dozens and sometimes into the hundreds. And what Mark will do going into a game is he had this remarkable ability that something would happen in the game and he'd go, I can remember something. I'll give you an example. I did a Toronto Maple Leafs game back when I was with Hockey Night in Canada, and James Van Riemsdyk scored one of those goals that we've all seen him score. Beautiful little in tight, great wrist action, and then puts it upstairs. Okay, so we replay that goal, of course, as you do. Scores Van Riemsdyk, and the color guy does it. So the play continues, and we're coming up on the next whistle, and Mark jumps onto the intercom, which I can hear in my headset in my ear. And Mark jumps in and he says, "We're going to show that last Van Riemsdyk goal, and I want you to talk about how good he is in tight," which we already had. "And I'm going to show 4 others that he scored just like it last season." So for him to be able to gather all of that together within minutes and have it ready to go, that's the kind of producer that he is. So you have those producers. You have other producers. There was one guy who I work with at TSN who I won't name, but he's a very, very good producer. But the problem is that he would go into a game and he would have decided what the narrative of that game was going to be. And so he would have highlights, he would have visuals to support that narrative. And damn it, that was going to be the narrative, whether or not it was the real narrative in the game or not, because he built all these things and all those elements were going to go in. So you have that type of producer. Then I've also done shows that are color commentator driven, which to me are probably, if I had to pick, I think can be the best shows, maybe a combination of producer, color commentator, that sort of relationship there. Because in almost every case, the color commentator has either coached or played the game. So they have an insight and a different eye and a knowledge that you as a broadcaster, certainly as a play-by-play announcer and as a producer, you don't have. So I've done shows where it's more driven by the color commentator. And then I've also done shows driven by me, the play-by-play announcer, but that's a very extreme example. In my case, those shows would tend to be back in the early days at TSN when we would do broadcast anything and everything. So you might be doing some small minor hockey tournament in Western Canada somewhere that was going to have 10 viewers. And what would typically happen is they would put an experienced commentator, me, onto the show with a young producer who maybe hadn't produced a game. This was going to be their first opportunity. And so in those cases, I would never go in and say, this is what you have to do. However, I would certainly try to push them in a direction that I thought was going to serve the show best, more so than I would with an experienced producer. So those are the three different types of, I guess, story drivers, narrative drivers that you'll find.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't produce any live events at TSN, but I remember those early days of TSN, and I've talked about this before, so it's no secret. Boy, you did not want to show any weakness. So even if you didn't know what you're doing or didn't have it all, you had to look like you had it all. So the approach you had with a producer like that was both intelligent and kind, and the best way to get a result out of that.
Well, you would always, certainly my approach was, and I can only speak for myself, and I still try to approach things like this whenever I'm managing people, is, you have to have respect for people. And so, to that example that we're talking about, you've got a young producer who's really nervous, and they, in their mind, this is Game 7 of the Stanley Cup final, even though it's the final of a midget hockey tournament in Northern Alberta. But to them, it's a big, big deal. It's their chance. And the best result you're going to get out of them is by going in and saying, hey, would you think about this? And I've done that, and this might be a good idea, so that they can go, yeah, I think we'll try that. And then when it turns out well, you go, hey, Craig had a great idea. Don't need to know that it was your idea. Craig had a great idea. Make Craig feel like he did it. I mean, that's just good management, making people feel good about what they're doing and have ownership of it, because you're always going to get the best performance out of a person then. Yeah,
positive reinforcement goes a long, long way. And, you're talking about one of the things that's sort of my new mantra. The new thing I'm pushing is people have to do a better job of listening. One of the reasons I'm doing this show is as I've gotten further along in my career and I've done all different types of genres, I've learned something new in every genre, and not always from the person that I'm reporting to, often the people that have reported to me. And it really is the most exciting thing to learn something new and realize that you now have a broader palette from which to paint. So, in the past, I might have been a little defensive about those things, but now I love it. Any chance you get to learn something new is, uh, is just a better day.
Well, you're a fool if you don't take advantage of it. I've got a mentor I had back very early in my career when I was a runner for Hockey Night in Canada was a guy named Doug Beeforth. And I remember, sitting around one of the many lunches that I had with Doug and talking about, people in the crew and so on and so forth. And he said something that's always stuck with me. He was here he was a producer for Hockey Night in Canada, and making time for me, at the time he was a bit of a mentor to me. Not a bit of, he was a mentor to me. But I remember something he said. He goes, the thing to keep in mind, he goes, the audio guy can have a great idea. The script assistant can have a great idea. The cameraman can have a great idea. As the producer, you get to decide ultimately what's going to happen, but don't shut those things off. Don't dismiss an idea from somebody because they're an audio assistant, which for those of you not in TV, that's not a high position on the production pecking order. It's typically a starting position, and you would aspire to move up from that. But his point being, hey, everybody can have a good idea, and if it can make the show better, you should be all ears, no matter who's saying it.
Yeah, and I worked on productions and in work situations where people have held those things so tightly. And there's two problems with it. One is that if you own everything, then everything is your fault. And whether you're willing to own that fault or not, everybody else is going to know it. And also, you're never going to get the best product because there's no way you can think of everything. There's no way your head is in every corner of the production to know what the best thing to do every time is.
No, it's impossible, and it's. I think perhaps I like to think, as with many things in the world right now in society, we're perhaps slightly more enlightened than we were 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and in another 30 or 40 years we'll be more enlightened than we are now. But my point being that I like to think that most good managers take that approach, and I've worked for some bad ones. Quite recently, I worked for some really bad ones. But I like to think that, maybe the next generation of people who are managing are going to have the enlightened approach that we're talking about.
I really hope you're right. So let's move into, oh man. That's a different show entirely.
Oh, yeah,
maybe when I do the business heroes, I can do that. Let's just talk about the jump from play-by-play, which is peppering in little bits of information on a tight schedule and servicing all these other needs in the show, to podcasting, which is a much broader canvas on which to work. How did you find that difference as a storyteller?
Well, I mean, you touched on the most obvious one. When you are doing a live play-by-play broadcast, as I did for many years, NHL, NBA, Major League Baseball, international hockey, it's a live show, it's flying by, and you are constrained by time. You have to get this in before this. You have to get that in before we get to here. When you do a podcast, at least the podcast I'm doing and many of the ones I listen to, time is very elastic. It's an elastic commodity. There's no, the podcast is going to take as long as the podcast takes. Mine typically go between an hour and a half and 2 hours. And I am going to tell stories. I'm going to draw the narrative through the entire podcast. I'm going to give my guest, most importantly, lots of time to tell stories and reflect their views on what's going on. So it's a wonderful, wonderful medium that way, because you can let it breathe. There's time for reflection. There's time to go off down rabbit holes, which will happen when you're talking about music or art or anything like that. And it's fantastic. I love it. It's a great storytelling medium.
I'm impressed with the research in it, just things that you'll drop in there. How much research do you do on the Beatles prior to the examination of each album?
Well, I know a lot about the Beatles, just like I know a lot about sports. It's just because I've been listening to Beatles music since I was 8, 9 years old, and I would buy books about them and read all I could about them. And it's just something, the accumulation of knowledge over 40, 50 years. Um, but when I'm doing a specific album, I will comb through many of the books that I have, and I will dig down into every song and try to find some angles on there, little things that people might not know, things that the guests might not know, because that's been fun as well. Where you'll have a guest who's an experienced music person, and you'll give a fact about a song, and they'll go, "Oh, I wasn't aware of that," and that's fun as well. And then that'll get them off on some kind of a riff. I mean, the easy thing about doing this type of thing with the Beatles is that there is not another pop group in the recorded history of music, in the history of time, that has been as meticulously documented as the Beatles have. The sort of dean of Beatles researchers is a guy named Mark Lewison, and the first sort of tome that he did that I bought many, many years ago was called The Beatles Recording Sessions at Abbey Road. It's still in print. And it goes through every single recording session that the Beatles had at Abbey Road Studios in London during their entire career. And it goes through it hour by hour, track by track. And that's your starting point. And then you can comb into many, many different biographies and now websites. So there's no shortage of places to go to get information. If anything, it's tough trying to distill that information into what I can use in the show.
Yeah, that must all come from the recording logs they would make for everything. All of that stuff has to be documented. You find that a lot in jazz. They'll know, the people who love jazz will know every artist on every session because those things had to be recorded, because that's how they kept track of recordings and that's how people got paid. And they've turned into these other wonderful documents of people's careers.
Well, it's funny too, because even then, it depends where it was. Now, you have to put yourself in post-war Britain. So they just obviously come out of the Second World War, and EMI, which was a huge company, British-owned company, who owned Abbey Road Studios. They were called EMI Studios at the time. And yes, it was the engineers walked around wearing white lab coats. And the producers sat up in the control room, and they did not come down onto the floor of the control room to talk to the artists, and the artists did not go up to the control room. It was very regimented, and they kept meticulous documents about all of these sessions, not just with the Beatles, but anybody who recorded at EMI Studios back at that time. But then you'd go down the road to, say, for example, Trident Studios, which was a newer studio that came to be in the 60s in London, and they didn't keep those kinds of records because there wasn't that kind of corporate culture that they had at EMI dating back into the 20s and 30s. So, I mean, there's another story right there, and we can thank the boffins at EMI for being like that, because that's why we have, as a starting point, this trove of documents about the Beatles recording sessions. So you know what take it was that ended up being the usable take for I Want to Hold Your Hand. Or you know that Twist and Shout was the last recording made during that session, and they only had one take because John Lennon was going to lose his voice. You know all of that because of the documentation.
EMI sounds like the Manhattan Project.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, that's another podcast too. But it's remarkable. I mean, it was at that time probably the finest recording studio of the world. Like all the compressors and the limiters and the boards, they were all built by EMI engineers. They didn't pick up the phone and order one from Toshiba or from another company. They were built, literally put together in a shop, in a lab, an engineering lab, and installed at EMI Studios. It was all proprietary stuff. So yeah, it was very much like that.
Yeah, it doesn't make it sound any less like the Manhattan Project.
No, no.
For obviously the encyclopedic knowledge of the Beatles and knowing where to get more information, how much work did you do on the artists you were going to be bringing in, not just to know enough about them, but to know about the relationship with the Beatles?
Well, that is honestly, that's probably the most challenging part of the research. is, there's lots of information out there about the Beatles. I know a lot about the Beatles, and I've read all the books. However, there isn't as much information out there about the recording career of the Rheostatics. Dave Bedini was one of my guests. There is information out there, thank you, Internet, but it's very patchy, and you certainly don't have meticulous logs of their recording sessions. And to be quite honest, I love the Rheostatics. I love Blue Rodeo. I love Stephen Page and the Bare Naked Ladies, but I don't have the knowledge of their tracks, track by track, that I do of the Beatles. I don't know that anybody does, other than perhaps the principals involved in those recording sessions. Mm-hmm. So, but it's very important to have that, because there are so many times, and something I really do try to do, because this artist is being giving of their time, is I do want to draw on their experience. So, for example, a show that I'm doing with Julian Taylor, who's a great artist. He's got an album out now called The Ridge. And he's doing Band on the Run. And there's an interesting parallel. Band on the Run, quick story, was really born out of a lot of adversity. Just before Paul McCartney left to travel to Lagos, Nigeria to record the album, which is where the basic tracks for Band on the Run were recorded, two of his bandmates left. The lead guitar player and the drummer left. So you were just left with Paul McCartney, his wife Linda, who was an adequate keyboard player at best at that time, and then you had Denny Lane. So they went down there. While they were there, the recording studio wasn't up to the standard he thought. It was only 8-track as opposed to 16 or 32-track he would have back in a London studio. He got robbed at knife point. All of the cassette demos for the album were stolen. So they had to sort of start over again without any demos, going from memory. So there was adversity. And out of that adversity came a spectacular album. Some believe his best solo work. So I asked Julian, is there an example from your career of adversity leading to a good record? And he came back with a fantastic story about an album they had recorded, and the recording studio was broken into, and the computer that had all of the finished album on it was stolen. So they had to go back in and start from scratch. And out of adversity came a really good record called Blank Tape Levy, real heavier than the stuff he does now. But there you go. So doing a bit of research into what's happened in their career can often engage them more to tell stories.
Well, I noticed that in the Stephen Page show, you identified what a question I thought should have been asked right off the bat, which you did, was he picked a Paul McCartney solo album. And, here is an artist who is known for being, certainly the show is on a Canadian landscape, who's known as being a front member of one of the most popular Canadian bands ever. And he's doing a show about one of the most popular bands ever. And as someone who's left a popular band, he picks an album by somebody who left a popular band.
And like McCartney, as we talk about on that Stephen Page episode, it was a question, an obvious question to ask, but the twist I tried to put on it is that, like McCartney, he very much plowed his own furrow, walked his own line, whatever analogy you want to use. McCartney, when he left the Beatles, the first thing he did was an album called McCartney, which today you would call it a stripped back, almost indie album. And it could not have been more different from the last Beatles album that was recorded, Abbey Road. Great production, orchestral arrangements. There was none of that on McCartney. So he went off and did something completely different, as did Stephen Page. He left the Bare Naked Ladies, and the first couple of things he did, he worked with an orchestra. He also did some writing for stage. So he just went off and he did some very different things. Nothing like he would have done with the Bare Naked Ladies. And he's also a guy who likes to try different things, like McCartney. So it was an interesting choice, and Stephen Page did it proud, going through it track by track. That was an interesting show. It was a fun one to do.
And fun's the right word. The shows really are fun to listen to. And my analogy for your fandom, I'm a big Springsteen fan. So if there was a Springsteen analogy, I would go to listen to that. I have listened to your show because I like you and like your work, and not more for you than the Beatles, more for the Paul than the Walrus. But I've really enjoyed them. It's so nice to hear not only the bits of those great songs, but to hear them through ears that I don't possess, to hear a professional musician weigh in on these songs we know so well. So, and you do a great job of setting that up.
That's thank you very much. That's what I'm hoping to achieve is, I can, as I tell the guests, I say, look, I have half a dozen nerdy facts on every single song, and I'll sprinkle them in. I never end up using all of them, which to draw back to the narrative of doing a live play-by-play broadcast, you'll go in with storylines and notes to enhance the story that you're trying to tell, and end up using in a play-by-play broadcast, I'll use 10% of them, 20% of them tops, unless something happens like the glass falls out and we have to fill for 20 minutes, which is rare. In the podcast, it's the opposite. I probably use 60 or 70% of the notes that I have. I do leave some on the table, but I always tell the guests, look, I've got lots of that. Don't worry about it. But you jump in whenever you want, and you take whatever angle you want. So I've had guests who've taken more of an angle that you and I would take, where I really like this song. I like the way the guitar sounds, and to me it says, and they'll talk about the lyrics. But then I've had a guest on the show that's out right now about Abbey Road, Jane Gowan, who fronts an indie band called The Real Shade. Jane is a properly trained musician. She can score music. She plays several instruments. She can read music. And she talks about chord changes, minor seventh chords, and the transition from this chord to that chord, and why that chord makes you feel that way. And I just love that stuff because it's something I can't do. And so talking to a musician to bring that out is a really cool thing. Just as a music fan, to get to talk music with somebody who's a professional musician is something that I really enjoy.
And in an interview, you are both guiding and following the conversation. And no surprise, given your career and the success in your career, that you are an expert at following the puck.
Yeah. I try to follow the puck and keep up with it. Keep up with the play. That's key.
Well, Paul, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Love the podcast. Keep them coming. And I look forward to a lot of this COVID nonsense being over so we can have a proper beer, not sitting 6 feet apart.
I hope so, Craig. It's always fantastic to catch up with you. It really is. And it's great to talk about the old days. I have many, many wonderful memories that you're involved in. And it's nice to talk about what we're both up to now. So good luck to you and continued success. And thanks for the chance to talk about the podcast.
Yeah, it's excellent. All right. Thanks, Paul. Are you a storyteller who wants to tell the story of how you tell stories? Yes? Then I want to hear from you. Drop me a line at craig@colbyvision.net and tell me a little bit about yourself, your career, and some of the particulars of your process. Colby Vision is a storytelling company working in the broadcasting and the business world. Send me an email if you need help with either. Thanks to Tim Vesely for the music, and Kevin Francisco for the graphics, and Dave White for the editing. And thanks to you for watching Narrative Drive Time.